kind of learn about today, and hopefully we'll do the best I can. We had a lot of alarms last night, so hold on. Let's bring up the page. Fire tablet. We're not sure who that is. Okay. Share the page here. Okay, so we're holding Gufa Chizkiah. So we had a discussion where we said that there was two things we have to question. Number one is if Teverya was a city that was walled in the times of Yeshua ben Nun, and therefore be a city that has a requirement that they do the Megillah, they read the Megillah on the 15th, or if Chizkiah or if Teverya was not. So we were learning that Rabbi and Chizkiah kind of had a disagreement or a different Masorah, a different tradition. Rabbi was clear, had no question that Teverya was considered a city that was walled, and therefore he would read the Megillah on the 15th in Teverya. We know that Rabbi again lived in Teverya, Tiberias, which is on the Kinneret, as we're going to learn now, towards the on the west side of the Kinneret. The east side starts the Golan Heights, and Chizkiah wasn't sure. Chizkiah wasn't sure if Teverya was a walled city, and therefore it says Chizkiah read twice. He read on the 14th and he read on the 15th. Now we're going to learn about that itself, and we discussed it briefly last time, and go over again the question of what we do when we don't have a doubt and what's considered a doubt. I mean, what is a suffix and what is the suffix? Okay, so let's first see the text. Gufa, we learned before that Chizkiah Karbi Teverya, Chizkiah would read in Teverya Ba'ar Beisar u B'Chamesar. He would read both on the 14th and the 15th of Megillah, which means he celebrated, or he kept the holiday of Purim both on the 14th and the 15th. And the reason why he read it twice, because he was not sure, he had a doubt, was the city of Teverya a city that was walled from the days of Yeshua ben Nun. Okay, as it's going to be told over and over again, the question of Teverya is the name Teverya, Tiberias, comes from the Caesar, and it was built as a city, as a gift for the Caesar Tiberius by Herod, and Herod, of course, lived only towards the last 100 years of the Second Temple. So obviously, Teverya, as we know it, as so to say, the city that was built for Rome or for the Roman emperor, was way after Yeshua ben Nun, but he rebuilt the city. The question is if the city itself initially was a city that, before it was rebuilt by Herod, a city that was walled from the days of Yeshua ben Nun or not. And if it was walled in the days of Yeshua ben Nun, would make it a city that needs to be read, that the Megillah is read on the 15th. So now the Gemara says like this. So we said before that Rebbe was clear, and Chizkiah had a question. So the Gemara says, but I just want to say one thing. The question that the Rishonim, the commentaries that have, which is the Ritva and others, is why would he read it twice? Means what do we do usually? Is there's a rule of thumb that clearly the story of Purim and the reading of the Megillah, as the Rambam, when he writes about the laws of Hanukkah and Purim, writes that these are midrabanan, they're rabbinic. And there's stories that happened, and the holidays that were created for things that happened after the Torah, right? After the Torah was given, meaning in Har Sinai, it happened, either Purim happened between the first and second temple, and Hanukkah happened towards the beginning of the second temple. But they were considered rabbinic holidays. They are considered rabbinic holidays. So the rule of thumb is that like we said before about the question of keeping Shiva, that on the first day, which is midaraisa biblical. So what do we do when we have a doubt? Suffix Rabbanan. A suffix, you have a doubt in something rabbinic. So we know the rule is that if it's midaraisa, suffix midaraisa, a question of something that's biblical, then it's lechumra. So if you don't know if you did something biblical, so you have to do it again, or you have to go according to the severity of the doubt. But in a situation of something that's rabbinic, suffix rabbanan lekula. So what would be the suffix? What would be the doubt? How would you react on the doubt of Purim lekula? So you have two choices really, and the real choice would be not to read the Megillah at all. You don't know what you're supposed to do. Either it's the 15th or the 14th. So you go Lakula, you don't read the Megillah. But how can you not read the Megillah? So the Rishonim go into the question, if we go in this case, Safek Rabbanan Lakula, and therefore we go after the Roiv, means most cities are not walled from the days of Joshua, and therefore we're going to go Lakula, meaning to say that we're going to go according to the Roiv, go where that's let's say a city like Teverya that has a doubt, a question on it. We would read it always on the 14th because we'd go according to the majority. That's not really going with the raw, so to say, rule of Safek Rabbanan Lakula. You would not read it at all. But we cannot read it because then you would think that they weren't part of the miracle, and you would think that they didn't agree with the miracle, and there's a concept of Psuma Nisa, celebrating and publicizing the miracle. So therefore, the question of reading it twice is not so simple. So there's another thing, though. In between what's called rabbinic and biblical is what's called Divrei Kabbalah. Divrei Kabbalah would be anything that is not clearly in the 5 books of Moshe, that could be alluded to or coming as a tradition from the other books of the Navi, of the Nevi'im and Ksuvim. And then Divrei Kabbalah are more severe than the Rabbanan straight up. And therefore, the Divrei Kabbalah, based on them being more severe than the Rabbanan, the Rabbinic, because they come from the story of Chanukah and Purim, is a story that's mentioned in the Tanakh. It's mentioned in the book of Esther. And Esther is part of the Tanakh, it's part of the writings. So therefore, it's Divrei Kabbalah, and Divrei Kabbalah are more stringent than the Rabbinic, and therefore you would have a reason to read it for sure. It wouldn't be a regular Safek Rabbanan Lakula, and therefore you would also read it twice. It means that the reason why we read it twice, because reading it twice, there's no real basis for that in the Rabbinic, but it's Divrei Kabbalah, so it's different. That's basically in a nutshell the difference of opinions. You have the Ritva who says. He says the Medina, the Be'emes Medina, Hechenim Safkle Havale Lemeimer Sveikin Rabbanan Kulav Leslie Mikr Klal. The Ritva says, in theory, we shouldn't read the Megillah at all in the city we have doubt. Now the problem is that the doubt of Teverya, and this is where things get complicated, is the doubt of Teverya a regular doubt or a different doubt? We're going to see that the doubt of Teverya there was no question that Teverya was a walled city. The question is if it was considered, according to the conclusion of the Gemara, is it considered a walled city enough in the days of Joshua to make it your typical walled city that would have the benefits of a walled city, and therefore would be read on the 15th. And the problem, which we're going to come to, we're skipping a little bit ahead, is that one of the walls of Teverya was the Galilee, was the Sea of Galilee, was the lake, the Kinneret. So is that third part or fourth part of the wall considered a wall enough to make it a walled city of Teverya? So the suffix was not if it was a walled city. The suffix was the halacha of the walled city. And therefore, according to Maseches Rishonim, therefore it has a different law of suffix, and therefore he reads it twice. If you have a city that we just don't know, for instance, like we said before, the Levush said that no city in Europe was or in Western or Eastern Europe was walled in the days of Yeshua. We have a Kabbalah that it was not. So that's not a suffix. But if you have cities that were in doubt in the East, because obviously there was a population in the East before the Jewish people came to Israel. So cities in the East, whether it's maybe even Turkey or parts of Macedonia. So then and we were going to see that there was a city that was in Shusha, it was in Babylonia, that they know that it was a walled city in the times of Purim. So then the question is, if cities outside of Eretz Yisrael have to read the 15th or not, and if we could be sure that the walls were there before, etc. But there's a question if it was walled or not. Here the question is if halachically the walled city of Teverya is considered a walled city for Purim. Okay. So therefore, there would be a reason that Chizkiah reads 2 days as opposed to not reading at all or reading only on the Roiv, going with the majority. But that's basically what the questions that they say. The answer of the Ritva is, why don't we go Safek Rabbanan Lakula and not read it at all? So he says the Divrei Kabbalah Kishel Divrei Hava Ela Kadesh La Yemer the Lo Yisrael Ninu Umashim Pesuma Nisa. So therefore, he says we would read it. He reads it 2 days, or maybe they would read it on the 14th to go according to the Roiv. And it says, it's according to the Ritva, what Ritva says, according to the letter of the law, Chizkiah should have read it on the 14th, The Chizkiya kind of went above the letter of the law and read it twice. The second time, according to the Ritva, would be without a bracha. So I'm going to bring it down. He says over here. He brings on the Rambam. The Rambam in chapter 1 of Hilchos Megillah Law 11 says the Memakim Safik, if you have a doubt, Karim B'Shnei Yom Mevarchim Rak B'Yom Rishon. So the Rambam paskins that if you have a doubt, you read 2 days, and you only make a blessing on the first day because that's the Zman. We go with the bracha with Roiv, and so says the Tur. The Chassam Sofer writes about the question of are we more careful with Divrei Kabbalah than regular Divrei Chachamim. Okay, so from here we see that there's really 3 levels when we come to severity of Torah mitzvahs. You have the biblical, you have rabbinic, and you have what's called Divrei Kabbalah, which are kind of in between, whether it's mentioned in Tanakh, etc. Okay, so let's see Rashi. Rashi says like this. Let's continue. So Chizki kar b'Teverya b'Abbas v'Chemes Misafkei Mikaf Scham Meiseshu B'Nun Hilai. Omi Misafkei. And the Gemara asks question: how does he have such a question? How's Chizki b'Chal have a question of if Teverya was a walled city? Does he have a question in Teverya? V'chsiv. We learned in another case of walled cities. We'll get to that in a second. V'ari mifsar hatzidim. What were the fortified cities where Tzidim Tzer, Chamas, and Rakas Vikineres? So these were the walled cities. What does it mean, the walled cities? The Kaimel and Rakas Utfer, and Rakas is Tver. Okay, so we have a verse. There's another place in Torah where walled cities come into play. Is what's called Orichaima. The question is when a person came to the land, they divide the land according to the tribes, and each person got their portion, and they owned the land. Usually, you had to do is if you sold land, it goes back to you in the time of the Yovel. There's a difference if the land is a city in a walled city. There's different laws about selling your property in a walled city. It's a different discussion, which is the laws of Orichaima, of walled cities, open cities, fields, etc. So the question is, what were the walled cities that they came into Eretz Yisrael that had the special laws when it comes to selling real estate? It's nothing to do with Purim. Selling real estate is considered an Orichaima. Is this a walled city or not? So the Torah tells us. In Yeshua, in Joshua, it says, what were the walled cities in the times of Joshua? It says, Mifsar Hatzidim, which is an area, I guess a city. Sorry, Mifsar Hatzidim Tzer, Chamas, Rakas, and Kineres. These were different cities that were walled in the days of Joshua. And we learned that what is Rakas? Even though you would think maybe Kineres is Rakas, but is Teverya, but not. Rakas is Teverya. So clearly, in the days of Joshua, Rakas was Teverya was a walled city. So why would you not read the 15th? Why is Chizkiya questioning? So the problem was not, again, Chizkiya's problem was not if Teverya was a walled city. Chizkiya's question was, is it a walled city enough to be considered for Purim reading? Why? Because it had one side, it had the sea. So it wasn't totally boxed in. Like it says, in other words, there was no physical wall. Let's see. Ve'ari mifsar hatzidim b'sefer Yeshua benachlis Naphtali. It's talking about the area of Naphtali. I don't know if anyone has been to Eretz Yisrael. That here, so Teverya is kind of the base of the Galil, right? So the Galil kind of goes. The lower Galil is to the west of the Kinneret, and the upper Galil is the northwest of the Kinneret, kind of going from the top of the Kinneret, going towards the west would be the upper Galil. To the left, to the east is the Golan Heights. So, and by the way, just a point of note, as people talk about the Golan Heights, the high mountains of the Galil are higher than the Golan Heights. For instance, there's a place in Eretz Yisrael that's well further up north than the Kinneret. It's called Ramat Naphtali, because it's in the area of Naphtali. And the Ramat Naphtali is very high. I've been there for Shabbos. So he says that the area is in the Nachlas Naphtali. The Kaimel on the Kamon, the Rekes, I guess Teverya was part of Naphtali, is Teverya. So it's considered a fortified city. And Rekes is Teverya, so it was a fortified city in the days of Joshua. So what was the question? The Chad Gisa Shura di Yamahava. One of its walls was the sea. Ein la chayma mitzad it says like this, Ein lachayma mitzad echad. It doesn't have a wall from one side. And hold on a second, I want to make sure. Barbara, is the stream going well?
Yeah, you're going fine.
Oh,
Yeah.
my picture shows like it's freezing. The Chad Gisa shur the Yamav. One of the sides was the sea, or the Sea of Galilee. Ein lachayim mitzadech. It doesn't have a wall. El hayom chaymasa. What is its wall? Is the sea. Is that considered properly walled for the questions of Megillah? So let's just see Rabbi Steinsaltz footnote over here. It says the sages discuss Chizki's uncertainty mainly due to what can be deducted from here with regard to other places where there is uncertainty as to whether a city was surrounded by a wall. It is possible to understand from Chizki's actions that whenever there is an uncertainty as to whether the particular city was surrounded by a wall from the days of Joshua, the Megillah should be read on both days. So it means if someone just looks at the Gemara, it would say, like I said before, it's not so simple. Chizkiya's case versus all cases. That maybe you think that the rule of thumb is anytime you have a doubt if the city was walled or not, right? Obviously, United States, that whole area is not. But from the east of Eretz Yisrael, for sure, there's cities that were walled. So you would just read it 2 days. However, this conclusion would contradict the principles normally used to resolve uncertainty, which would be, like I said, you go with either you don't do it at all, or you read it with the Roiv, with the 14th. These principles state that in case such as this, the majority is followed. Okay, that's not all opinions. Rabbi Steinsaltz is quoting the opinions of the Roiv that we would go after the majorities, meaning there's 2 shaylas over here. If there's a shayla in what the situation is, so you go with the majority. If you have a shayla what the halacha is, then it gets complicated. What do you mean? If Chizkiya says, we know it's walled, because we have a verse, it says in Joshua, Teverya was Rekes is Teverya. That's not whatever. Now we're going to go to the Gemara to find out if Rekes is Teverya or not. Of course, that's not to be taken for granted. But let's just start with the assumption that Rekes is Teverya. So if Rekes is Teverya, and Rekes is mentioned in Joshua as an Ari Mifsar, as a fortified city, so then he has an halachic question according to the Gemara. Is the Sea of Galilee considered a wall or not? If you have a doubt to know, is the city a walled city? That's not a halachic question. That's a question, is what was the status of the city? Then it would make sense to go to the Roiv. Most cities are not fortified, so you go in the 14th. But Chizkiya has a bigger problem. Because therefore, it's not so simple, according to the Ritva, that he did Midas Chassidus, or if it's either nothing or both. Because if it's a suffix, then the suffix is, you know it was walled, you don't know the halacha. So maybe you'd go to the kula and you wouldn't read it at all. So he says, but let's just see what Reb Steinsaltz says over here. So the principle normally used to resolve uncertainty, the principle states that in cases such as this, the majority is followed, and similarly, that with regard to uncertainty concerning rabbinic law, like I said, suffix rabbanan, is the halacha is lenient. Therefore, the Gaonim explain. The Gaonim, of course, were the time period between the Talmud and the Rishonim, pretty much. A long period of time. The Gaonim explain that distinction must be made between the case of Tiberias and other cities whose status is uncertain. Why? With regard to Tiberias, Chizkiya was certain that the city itself existed in the days of Joshua, and his uncertainty was whether it was surrounded by a wall. Okay, so as I said, the suffix is in the halacha, not just if it was surrounded by a wall, if the wall that it had was a wall. However, with regard to the other cities, where the uncertainty is whether the city existed at all during the days of Joshua, there's certainly no reason to be strict. The Ramban writes, Nachmanides, that when Chizkiya read on 2 days, due to uncertainty, he was acting only on a righteous custom in Midas Chassidus. Again, it's not so simple with Midas Chassidus. This whole discussion, if he acted Midas Chassidus, or if the suffix is halachically or not, again, the question is what's the basis of the suffix? So the Goinim said the suffix was if it was walled or not. The other cities, we don't know if they existed. And Teverya did exist, but it's not. The Gemara actually concludes it's not about a suffix if it was walled or not. The suffix is that if the walled halachically was considered a wall. Okay. So then 7 seconds. If you're saying that the question was that he had a challenge of the Teverya of the Kinneret, so then there is no doubt. He should know that the halacha is that the Kinneret is not considered a wall, and therefore it was not walled, and therefore l'chatchila he should have only read it on the 14th. Surely it was not a wall. How do we know that the sea of the Kinneret, that opening means the sea? What's the idea? First of all, just to put it bluntly, the sea of the Kinneret is like saying in Seattle, at Lake Washington. I mean, the Kinneret is maybe a little bit than Lake Washington. I don't know exactly. To drive around Lake Washington also takes a bit of time, and to drive around the Kinneret also takes a bit of time. People swim the Lake Washington. People swim the Kinneret. It's a normal exercise thing to swim the Kinneret. Obviously, you have to be a good swimmer. My wife feels she could swim the Kinneret. Others I know who swim the Kinneret, obviously with help, with people watching you. But it's something that can be done. So to compare, let's say the Teverya, which is on the Kinneret. Let's even say the Kinneret was higher, maybe higher back. It can't be too much higher because we have ancient walls of Teverya till today. So but you can't compare, let's say, a city that's on the sea, on the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, or even the Mediterranean Ocean, where it's a proper sea, to the Kinneret that's really, with all due respect, a lake. So it's not really. I mean, it's obvious that you wouldn't say that if someone could swim from the east to the west into Teverya, it's not that protected. So the Tanya we learned asher loy chayma v'loy shor igar. We learned when it comes to the laws of Ari Chayma, what is considered a wall. So we learned a brisa that says it has to have a wall. V'loy shor igar. Shor igar means, there's two opinions. Shor igar either means like you have in ancient times where they built cities in circles. Let's say the structures or part of the structures in circles, and the houses acted as a wall. Because if you build house around in a circle, so the old cities in Europe are like that a bit. So it's like the ghettos. So it's not really 100% a wall because there's access into the house. People live there. It doesn't have the same fortification as a proper wall, but it creates the wall kind of environment. So the Gemara says no, that's not going to shor igar. Where there's houses making a wall, that's not considered a wall. I'm saying that says other opinions mean shor igar means not a complete wall with breaches in the wall, or saviv. So it says asher loy chayma saviv. So chayma means it has to be a proper wall, not igar shor igar, which is the houses of as a wall. Or saviv means pratel Teverya sheyam chaymasa. Teverya also is excluded. Why? It's excluded because it's the one of the walls is the sea, and that's not a good enough wall. So Rashi says, "What's chayma v'leishur igar? V'batei ir chayma chsiv." This is about the laws of batei ir chayma. Again, we're trying to compare the laws of Eretz Yisrael and what is considered a walled city that has unique laws of sale. Means you have a certain time to redeem the house. After that point of time, you can never redeem the house, etc. These are certain laws that are considered, especially for batei ir chayma. So what makes a walled city for the laws of real estate in Eretz Yisrael? And we're trying to compare it to the laws of Purim. So we say, we're talking about the laws of surrounded cities when it comes to the laws of real estate. And it's therefore it says in the verse, first of all, it has to be a city that has a wall, not a city without a wall. It's not a wall. It's not really a wall, it's just that the houses are made in a circle. And the walls of the house is the wall of the city. Its roof, so to say, is gag is in Aramaic is igor, and that's kind of the wall. That's the security. Is the cities. I mean, again, there's cities in Europe like that, etc. When it talks about cities of the field that don't have walls. Saviv miklal de batei ir chayma misuviv saviv, that it has to have a proper wall around it. Prat Teverya, this comes to exclude Teverya. Sheyam chaymaisa, that one of the walls is the sea. Shayam shala hi chaymaisa mitzadechad. They didn't have a wall built on the beach. The beach was the wall or the separation, and that's not enough to make it a near chayma. So here Rashi, so Reb Steinsaltz says that see if I'm missing anything for here. Reb Steinsaltz says like this. Some explain that the concept of the wall roofs as large roofs that reach the ground and encircle the city. Others explain that is an incomplete wall where only a portion of the city is surrounded. I'm not sure what he means by the if it means like an A-frame that goes all the way down. Because the question really is if you have a door that you walk out of the city from your house, like you open your front door and you're outside of the city, that obviously is not a wall. The question is, it could be that they built the city, these cities were that the entrance and the windows maybe were all facing inside the city. So it's kind of a wall, but it's not really a wall. Maybe that's what he means, that the roof goes all the way down to the floor. V'lo igar, not wall of roofs. A city which the roofs make up the walls, or the sea serves as its wall, do not have the halacha of a walled city with regard to the halacha of redeeming land. It's a real estate question. Rather, it's the status of an open courtyard city, which so says the Rambam in Sefer Zroim Hilchos Shmita V'Yovel 12:13. So the question is like this. So where are we back to? What's the question where we're in our Talmud? How could Chizkiah think that he was able to, he had a doubt. There's no doubt. Teverya is not a walled city. So it's straight up only 14. Question is why Rebbe says it was a walled city, but we're not talking about Rebbe now. We're talking about Chizkiah. So he says, so Chizkiah didn't have a doubt about the laws of real estate, the Ir Chayma. That he was clear. Obviously, the Brisa says it's not a walled city, it has a sea. But who says that the laws of the real estate is exactly the reason, the same exact laws of Megillah? Again, we discussed in the beginning of this of the tractate that the one of the reasons why there was a difference between the walled cities and the unwalled cities. And now also you have to remember this difference also applies to Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael. Just to go back to the history, Shushan was a walled city. Shushan, just to take the story straight up, Esther asked for an extra day to fight in the city of Shushan, which was the capital, the winter capital of the Persian Empire, which was the king was Achashverosh, of course. So everyone knows the story. Esther says we need more time in the city of Shushan. Achashverosh gives Esther an extra day. The people in Shushan fight on the 14th. Not only the 13th and the 14th, therefore they rest on the 15th, and therefore the holiday of Purim is on the 15th. The people in outside of Shushan had one day to fight their enemies, which was the 14th. So therefore they fought on the 14th, they fought on the 13th. They fought on the 13th, they rested on the 14th, Purim is on the 14th. So that's why we have the 2 days of Purim. The question is, who gets included in the story of Shushan? They decided, Esther and Mordechai, to give respect to Eretz Yisrael. The time of Purim was not a good time for the Jewish people because Eretz Yisrael was destroyed. The Jews were in exile. Yerushalayim was a city of churban, of destruction. To give covet to Yerushalayim, they went to go back to the cities that were surrounded by walls from the days of Joshua to also celebrate on the 15th like Shushan. So now we have to know what are those cities. Are the cities Purim? Are the cities, what cities were surrounded, and where were those cities surrounded? Another idea was that there was a difference between the celebration of Purim B'chlal. The people that lived in open cities were more vulnerable to be destroyed by their enemies. Why? Because the enemies could come in and they had no protection, they had no fortification. The people in the walled cities didn't feel Purim so much. So therefore, they made a special day for them. That's the Rishonim bring down. Another point is also, the question is, where was the walled cities that the people felt safe? If you're in a walled city and your enemy's in the walled city with you, how safe are you? It doesn't help you to have a walled city. If 90% of the city are Gentiles, they get a letter from Haman that says, kill the Jews in the city. So that the walled city doesn't help you much. So there's a question of walled city, and it has to be a walled city in Eretz Yisrael, kind of, that everyone was Jewish, and therefore they felt protected from the nations, because I'm sure the people in Eretz Yisrael also got the letters, you could kill the Jews on the 13th. So he says like this, so therefore Purim, it's not the exact same rules as the laws of real estate. So he says like this, clearly, for the laws of real estate, the Ari Chayma, what city can be redeemed, and when is a final sale, etc., the laws of Ari Chayma, this is not its place to discuss these laws. He doesn't have the question. We clearly have a pasuk in the Brisa that says Teverya is not a walled city. So when's the question? The Nikreis Megillah, for the laws of Purim, of reading the Megillah, because the Megillah says Prazim, the unwalled cities, the exposed cities. We don't know what's considered an exposed city for Purim. What's considered an enclosed city? With the laws of Megillah. Because you have, like this, he says there's two questions over here. Is the difference between them due to the fact that these unwalled towns are exposed, whereas those walled cities are not exposed? And now he says, if so, Teverya is also exposed. Like I said, the Kinneret, one side is not exactly an unexposed entry. Or the point is, the difference between the walled cities and unwalled cities are if you're protected or not. So the cities that were walled were protected. Again, this would only apply to cities that were only Jews. Because if there's any Gentiles inside, they have the edict to kill them, so it's not really helping them much. So you have the walled cities were mogain, they were protected, and an unwalled city was not protected, it was exposed. And for some reason, I don't understand the difference. I try to figure out the difference between Migla and Migne, that why Teverya, what's the difference between exposed and protected? I mean, exposed and protected is not really a major. I mean, what's the problem of exposed? That's not protected. But either way, he says that Teverya is considered protected but not exposed. Protected but exposed. If the issue is if the definition of a walled city is exposure, the Teverya is exposed, and therefore you would read on the 14th. And this is the subject, this is the doubt that Chizkiah had. Or is it a question of protection? And for some reason, the Kinneret was enough of a protection. Again, I don't. What's the problem of exposed? The problem of exposure is that it's not protected, right? That's the problem of exposure. All right. If we had a question, therefore, what do we see from here? The Chizkiah had a shaila in halacha. He didn't have a shaila in mitzias, right? There's a difference when you have a question of fact or a question of the law, right? If you have a city and say, I don't know the fact of the city, was the city a walled city or not? That's obviously you go after the Rav. But when you have a halach in the question, in the law, so that's what the Rishonim say. It's not so simple to say that zil basaruva, go after the majority. Because it's not a question of majority, it's a question of halacha. How do we paskin we know what Teverya was. Teverya had 3 walls and a sea. The question is that sea considered a wall enough for the laws of Purim? Because what's the problem of the exposure? Is it exposure or is it protection? And for some reason, it's exposed and protected at the same time. What's the question of Chizkiah? Le'inyan Mikra Megillah is only about reading of the Megillah. Why? It doesn't say the word in the Megillah. It doesn't say the word wall. It says prozim, exposure, open. V'she'enim prozim, not open. Ksiv. Okay, so here Rashi helps us a little bit about the difference between exposure and protected. Rashi used the word noiche lekilush. That even if you say that Teverya is exposed by the sea, and again, unless the sea went really high to the east, it couldn't go too high to the west, so then it was a bigger sea than it was, and that's possible. I mean, you have to remember something else. The whole water system on the east side of Eretz Yisrael is questionable how it was in the times of Joshua, right? If anyone goes down to the Yarden, to the river today, and you talk about the miracle the Jewish people crossed the Yarden, you'd be like, it's a little river. It's a little river. It's not exactly. It's not. You wouldn't. No one would wonder how the Jewish people crossed the Yarden, right? When the 1967 war, a lot of the Arabs that ran to Jordan, that's considered today the problem of the people that are refugees, they just ran across the Jordan River. So I mean that the Jewish people. I mean, obviously 600,000 people, millions of people. It's not so convenient to walk through the river, but it's not so like a shaila like crossing the Red Sea to get across the Jordan River today. Obviously, the Jordan, we have to assume the Jordan, and the way the Gemara explains in Saita, what happened in the Jordan River, the great miracle of the walls going up, you would have to assume the Jordan River was much larger in the days of Joshua, much wider, larger, more of a larger river. And it's very possible because today the water sources of the Kinneret, of the Kinneret, and the sources that feed into the Kinneret are being tampered with. And meaning to say, whether it's the water's coming from Lebanon, from the Banyas, all the water sources that feed the Kinneret, and the Kinneret feeds the Yarden, is being tampered with, and even from the Kinneret is being tampered with. So the waters of the Jordan River is being tampered with, and therefore we don't get a proper flow. It's very possible the Kinneret was much higher, and kind of as a bigger body of water, where the walls of the Kinneret were strong enough to say that it wasn't, like Rashi says, Ir Noichelikpush. It wasn't an easy city to conquer from the sea, if you wanted to approach it from the sea. And therefore, the 3 walls were enough to make it secure. It was still exposed, but it wasn't secure. It was still exposed, but it was secure. And therefore, you had a doubt, what's the prozim? Is the prozim exposure or the prozim is security? And wasn't an easy city to conquer. And therefore, basically, like I said before, if it's a city full of Jews, and Haman's men want to come and kill the Jews, they felt safer. That kind of ends, for now, the conversation of Teverya. We're going to get back to Teverya because we're not going to take it so simple. Like we said before, that in the Brisa, that Rekes is Teverya, right? When you're playing with names, it's harder to know what the name really is. Rav Asi Kari Megillah B'Hutzal Ba'Arbeser V'Chamesa. Now, after we know the story of Chizkiah, we have a city of Hutzal. Hutzal is a city in Babylonia, so it's clearly outside of Eretz Yisrael. But again, it's east of Eretz Yisrael. Babylonia obviously was a settled city, settled area in the times of Joshua. Right, people lived in these places. So Avram Avinu lived there in that area. So before he came to Eretz Yisrael, Rav Asi Kari Megillah B'Hutzal Ba'Arbeser V'Chamesa. He also read on the 14th and 15th. Okay, so here the suffix is not the same. Again, the doubt that Chizkiah had was the halacha doubt. The doubt that seemingly that Rav Asi had was a factual doubt. Was it walled or not? Others say, Rav Asi says, Hi, Hutzal the base Binyamin, Mukevas Chai Meis Mishu Binyamin. For some reason, Hutzal became a city of the house of Benjamin in post destruction of the first temple, meaning with the Jewish people. We know that the southern part of the kingdom of Yehuda, which is the south of Eretz Yisrael, there was the north kingdom, which was what's called the Yisrael, the kingdom of Israel. That was the 10 tribes, known as the 10 lost tribes. We learned about them in the Gemara Sanhedrin. They were exiled about 100 years before the destruction by Sancheriv. The south, which is considered Malchus Beis David, the kingdom of David, included obviously the tribe of Judah, which is the tribe of David, also the tribe of Benjamin. That's why Mordechai was from Benjamin, right? So they also were obviously exiled, and they started a city. They moved into a city called Hutzal, which obviously was a city, according to Ravasi, that was in the times of Yeshua. The question is if it had a wall or not. And others say that there was no question; it was a walled city, and therefore he read it on the 14th. Okay, so he says over here, what's Hutzal? He says, so first of all, the Tosfos Rosh says from this Gemara clearly we see that if we're 100% clear that there was a city that was walled outside of Eretz Yisrael, they read it on the 15th, because Hutzal is obviously in Babylonia. Hutzal is a small city in Babylonia, south of the city of Nahardah. This was a very old settlement, and apparently the Jews that resided there belonged to the exiled tribe of Benjamin. In Hutzal, there was a famous synagogue, which was described as a place where the divine spirit rests. A few sages are known to have lived in that city. Evidently, Rabasi is one of them. Okay. Omer Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says like this: Ki haveina talia amina milsa d'shel eilna l'saveh. When I was a child, I said something that I later asked the elders about. So Talia is like a young person. Ksheisinar, when I was a young child, he asked something. And we're going to see. Hold on, we're going to turn the page and see what he asked. And he was confirmed that he was right. I have to remember, if I'm not mistaken, Rabbi Yochanan lived a very long time. Rabbi Yochanan, I think, lived through the entire release time of the Amoraim in Eretz Yisrael. He was a young student of Rebbe, which means he saw Rebbe. For sure, I think he saw Rebbe. He was kind of a colleague of of Rav and Shmuel, who learned by Rebbe. Rabbi Yochanan could have been younger than them, but he's definitely learned by Rebbe. But Rebbe wasn't his only teacher. He had other teachers after Rebbe. But Rabbi Yochanan makes the Talmud Yerushalmi, and he was the head of the yeshiva. I believe Rabbi Yochanan lived a very long time. And so Rabbi Yochanan he was a big member of the Kabbalah, of the tradition of Torah. And when he was younger and he asked the elders, they said he was correct. That what was this issue that he wants to know? Again, we said before, we quoted a verse in Joshua that there were 4 cities, Ari Mifsar, fortified cities. One of them was Rekes, and one of them was Hamas. And we said that Rekes was Tiberias. So he says he found out that Hamas was Teverya. Hamas was Teverya. Avi, maybe you remember. What's the name of the water springs on the bottom of the Teverya? It's also called, there's waters, there's natural springs called Hamas something, I think. All right. So either way, he said Chamas is Teverya. V'lo Nikreis shmo Chamas al shum Chami Teverya, because we know that if you go south of Teverya today, till today, towards Reb Meir, towards Tzomat Tzemach, you will, after not too long, maybe we checked it, I think last time was about it was less than I think 2 kilometers, is Chamei Teverya, the Teverya hot springs, which is Rashi teaches us Chamat Geder, yes, thank you, tablet. Chamat Geder. So I'm not sure if that's from the same question of Rabbi Yochanan. Chamat Geder was named after the pasuk that talks about Chamat. That's what I was thinking. But so he says also Chamat is called Chamat because of Chamei Teverya. The Teverya well springs that Rashi quotes is there. The well springs are there from the times of the flood. That when the flood, it says Mayones, that the waters that came up from the floods from the ground closed up. Not all of them closed up. Some of them stayed open. And Rashi says, for instance, Chamei Teverya. We're going to go question on Shabbos. All the Chamei Teverya, the Teverya hot springs. And Rakes, and what is Rakes? Rakes is not Teverya. Rakes is Tzipori. Okay, this has nothing to do with the question of Chizkiah, because Chizkiah had a question on Teverya. Question is if the verse is Teverya or not. But he says Chamas is Teverya, and because of the Chamei Teverya, and Rakas is actually Tzipori. Rakas. Why was it called Rakas? Why was Tzipori called Rakas? Again, I closed the map, but we remember clearly that Rebbe moved later in his life to Tzipori, and that's why he planted the tree in Tzipori. The question was where he kept 2 days. Tzipori is up the hill of, like I said, the Galil is the hills. So, but in the lower Galil, kind of, it's straight beeline from Teverya straight towards the west. So that's Tzipori, and Tzipori is in the hills. So Rakes is Tzipori, V'lam Nikreis Rakes, Mishum de Midlaya Kirakta de Nahara. So it's because it is raised above the surrounding areas like the bank of a river. Like the bank of a river is higher than the river, right? The beach is higher. So to Teverya, Tzipori was higher than it was a hilltop. And that's why they called it Rakes. Kinneret Zu, what is Kinneret in the pasuk? So Rabbi Yochanan says, so Chamas is from the Chamei Teverya. Again, we did check before that Teverya of ancient times seemed to have been south of the city today of Teverya, though it seems like the city that Herod built was the Teverya that we have now. Because there's still today, if you go to Teverya, there's still parts of the old walls of Teverya. I'm not sure if those were walls that were built by the Crusaders, or they were built also. Those are remains of the walls of Tiberius of Herod himself. I think they're more connected to the walls of the Christians that came in the year 1000 or so. Crusaders. Mishum de Milsi Kirakta Dinara. Kinneret, where is Kinneret in the pasuk? It's a place called Ginoisar. V'lo Nikreis shmo Kinneret, the mitkei peira kikol the canary, because its fruit are sweet, like the sound of a kinnor is a harp. So like a harp makes a nice, pleasant sound. So too, the place of Ginsar was called Kinneret because not from the city, not from the, again, it's probably all interconnected, the names of the sea of the Kinneret. First of all, the Rashi quotes. I'm trying to think. Rashi, they talk about there's a few psukim we know about the Kinneret. I think first of all, the Kinneret, I think it says clearly in Torah, in Devarim, when it talks about the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael. I think also it talks about with the Yam HaGadol. There's a question of Yam HaGadol is a Rambam. Question of Yam HaGadol is the Kinneret or the Mediterranean. But either way, the Kinneret it was also from the word kinor, which means a harp, and therefore the city of Ginsar was called Kinneret because its fruits tasted sweet like a harp. The Ishtach Kavasei means Rabbi Yochanan, Rashi says, ran this by the elders. Again, Rabbi Yochanan lived a long time, so he ran this by the elders, and they agreed with him. But he lived after Rebbe, so it's not exactly that it was Rebbe was living in Tver and Rebbe was living in Sipori. Rekta de Nahar Sfasa Nahar Goivim in Nahar. The banks of the river are higher than the river, and therefore they called Tzipori Rekas because it was a high city. After Tzipori Yosheves Ba'aroy Shahar, Tzipori was a city on top of the mountain. This Tosfos, the Reb Stein's, the the Steinsaltz Institute put this Tosfos out of place. It's not here. Okay, Ginsur. Ginsur is the name of a beautiful valley that stretches along the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, north of Tiberias. Okay, again, anyone's familiar with that. So we have that if you're driving, let's say to Tzfas today, so you're going to go from Teverya. So you're going to, one of them, obviously there may be other ways, but the main way you would go from Teverya to Tzfas, you would drive along the west part of the Kinneret, and at the top, by near kibbutz, I think it's called Kibbutz Blum, you would make a left upwards towards northwest from the city from the top, the north top of the Kinneret, going towards Tzfas or Rosh Pina, that area, right? So I'm not sure how nice it is today. I mean, it's beautiful. You have to the right, to the left, you're going to have Mount Tabor. You're going to have beautiful hilltops. But the actual to the left, to the right, driving along the Galil, it's marsh a little bit. They have some beautiful places that were kind of colonized in the times of the British. There's a beautiful house there, but would I call it the nicest part or whatever? Who knows? But either way, Ginsur is the name of a beautiful valley that stretches along the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, north of Tiberias. Josephus describes the area as follows. Its nature is wonderful. Okay, obviously things change over time, as well as its beauty. Its soil is so fruitful that all sorts of trees can grow upon it. You do see a lot of trees over there. Also, in general, if you go to Teverya, and even by Teverya itself, those who've been there know by the boardwalk, there's trees that are there that you don't see in Eretz Yisrael. Very thick trees that branch out very strong. I don't know the names of those trees, but they're interesting. They almost look like jungle trees. And the inhabitants accordingly plant all sorts of trees there. So says Josephus. Josephus talks as if he's coming as a third person. He lived and he fought. He was a general. He was part of the uprising. He also lived in the north. For the temper of the ear is so well mixed that it agrees very well with these several sorts, particularly walnuts, I guess, which require the coldest there and flourish there in vast plenty. Okay. There are palm trees also which grow best in hot air, fig trees also, and olive grow near them, which yet requires an ear that is more tempered. So there's obviously different kind of environments. Today, the Kinneret area is kind of hot and stuffy. It supplies men with the principal fruits, with grapes, figs, continually during the months of the year, and the rest of the fruits as they become ripe together through the whole year. For besides the good temperature in the year, is also watered from the most fertile fountain. Okay, so basically, he writes in the War of the Jews that this area called Ginsur, the Ginsur Valley, which is north of Teverya, is a beautiful area. What was that called? It was called Ginsur. Was Chinor, which would make sense because it's also on the Kinneret. All right. Amar Rava. Rava objects to Rabbi Yochanan. He lived obviously later than Rabbi Yochanan. Does anyone disagree that Rakas is Teverya? Rabbi Yochanan says that Teverya was Hamas and Rakas was Sipori. Does anyone disagree with Rakas being Teverya? When people pass away, when people pass away here, Kishachev inish hacha hasam svidi lehachi gadol hu b'sheishayich v'shem le birakas. Okay, this is already, they say it's like shul fighting. So what happened was, I was talking to someone before we had this class about people who want to get buried in Eretz Yisrael. Where's the mocker that people would want to bury in Eretz Yisrael? I mean, obviously the first mocker is Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu dies passes away in Egypt, and he says, bring my body to Eretz Yisrael. Yosef passes away in Egypt, says, don't forget to take my body out of Egypt and bring it to Eretz Yisrael. And we know that the tribes are also buried in Eretz Yisrael. So we know where their burial places is. So we have a clear makar in the Torah, a source in the Torah that there's an idea to want to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. But how do we know that it continued, that there was such a concept that people wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael even throughout the diaspora? So Rava says even in the times of Rava, which is after the second destruction, second temple, the times of the Talmud, he says kishachav inishach, when someone would pass away over here. So how would they eulogize them? They would say Sfidi lehachi gadol hu b'sheishach. He's great in Sheishach, which is a reference to the area of Bavel. V'shem le b'rakas, and he has a name, means he's well known even in Rakas. And Rakas would be Teverya, which was the city of the rabbis. V'chimaski aroin el-hasim, when the person's casket made it all the way up or down, actually, from Bavel to the south to Eretz Yisrael, Sfedi lihachi, they would continue to eulogize. Oivei siridim yoishvi rakas su v'kablu harugi emek. So they would say that lovers of the remnants of the residents of Rakas, which is referring to Teverya, go out and receive the Haruge, those who died in the Emek. We know that Bavel is a valley, right? We learned that already in Parshas Noach, when it says that the people after the flood found the valley and they built the temple, they built the Tower of Babylon that was in the Emek. So go meet the people in the Emek. So Rashi says, so what do we see from this? The Rava says that from here we see that Rekes is clearly Teverya. How would they eulogize him? Again, this is a little hint to this, some ideas that's brought down many times in Chassidus, that how do you spell Bavel? Beis Lamed. But if you switch the Aleph Beis backwards, so then the first two letters of the Aleph Beis is Aleph Beis. The last two letters of the Aleph Beis is Taf Shin, going backwards. So if you would take the instead of being the first two, the last two, so Beis would be Shin. So instead of Bav would be Beis. And I guess, not going to do the math right now, but if you go in the same direction, Lam would return into Chaf. So therefore, instead of Bav, it will be Shashech, which is called Chiluf Aleph Taf Beis Shin. This is an idea that's used many times in Kabbalah and Chassidus, in grammar, in other places where they learn from words to gather ideas. V'shem loy berekes, yaitzi loy shem b'Teverya. That Rekes in Teverya, they knew about him because he was the yeshivas were in Teverya. I'm not sure why that's really a proof, because we learned that Tzipori also became. Didn't Rabbi Steinsaltz say it was a kind of a rivalry between Teverya and Tzipori? V'chimaski arin shel meis mibavel l'kveri b'Teverya, when you come be buried in Teverya. Amri hachi aspadinin kairin b'shvakim b'lashon hazeh shiatzu likras hameis. So when the body came up, right? If you live in Yerushalayim today, someone passes away, there's a car driving around announcing the death and the levaya. So those days also they had something similar. What would they announce? They would announce Oivei Sridi Oivei Yisrael. Yoishvei Rekes Suvi Kiblu Harugi Emek. The people live in Rekes, go give honor to the person who passed away in the valley. May say Bavel HaMuka, but Bavel's in the Emek. Okay, this Rashi also is out of its place. We'll get back to this Rashi. Let's go a little further. Now we know one of the famous people that made, one of the famous Amaroim that made a famous Aliyah that came to Eretz Yisrael was the famous Amoira Reb Zera. Reb Zera was born and early educated in Bavel. Of course, we have Hillel the elder. Hillel also came from Bavel to learn in Eretz Yisrael, but kind of we know Hillel lived in Bavel, but he basically learned by Shmai Vavtalion. His whole study of Torah was in Eretz Yisrael. But Reb Zera it was more of a story, because Reb Zera lived in Bavel and he fasted a tremendous amount of fast to forget all the Torah that he learned in Bavel. And he made it was more of a scene that Reb Zera came up from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, and then he restudied it again. And from this we learn many times that the study of Torah in Eretz Yisrael is greater than the study of Bavel. Therefore he fasted to forget it. So when he lived this great life where he moved from Bavel and he graduated and made Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. So Kinach Nafshid Reb Zera, when Reb Zera passes away. So when the Safadana, when they eulogized him, so they don't forget the fact that he comes from Bavel, he came from Babylonia. Again, it wasn't irregular for people to travel. I mean, obviously they traveled all the time. They did Aliyah. They did even in the Second Temple. You have to remember, even in the Second Temple's greatest times. Let's say after the Chashmonaim and in Yanei HaMelech and Shimon, all the Shimon Chashmon, all the great Chashmonaim kings. And Eretz Yisrael was very strong. Yanei HaMelech was very strong. We're going to learn a little later about Yanei HaMelech's conquers. So nevertheless, there was a very strong, large Jewish community that remained in Bavel post the story of Purim. They never went up with Ezra, and they stayed in Eretz Yisrael. And they stayed in Bavel. They gave money. They came up to the Beis Hamikdash. We know we consider that in our timing of asking for rain and all these things, and how we did the new month, and there was a very open channel between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. But so he says, but Reb Zera came up. So Psachilei Haisef Adana, how did they eulogize him? He said, Eretz Shiner Hara V'Yolda Eretz Fi Gidla Shashushel. So they said like this. They said like this. Reb Zera's birthplace can see. So they said like this: the land of Shinar, which is Bavel, which is where Reb Zera was born, conceived and bore him. The land of the deer, which is Tzvi, which is Eretz Yisrael, where he lived as an Reb Steinsaltz as an adult, but he was older. He came older. Raised her delights. Shashua's delights. Oino la, woe unto her. Omer Rakas ki ibda klichem dasa. So Rakas mourns, so to say, Reb Zera, because she lost her special instrument, which is referring to Reb Zera. So Eretz Tzvi, Eretz Yisrael, Gidla Shashusha Shal Shinar. The youth of Shinar was raised in Shinar in Bavel, but he lived his adult, or later in his adult life in Eretz Yisrael. So from this, Rava is saying that he disagrees with Rabbi Yochanan. Again, anything we've learned so far, one could argue, and I'm not the one to argue. That still doesn't give us a proof that Rekes is Teverya. Maybe Rekes is Tzipori, and all these things are in Tzipori. For some reason, the Gemara accepts what Rav is saying, that these would be a sign that that all this conversation of Haspedim, eulogies, and praise, and referring to Rekes would be only talking about Teverya and not Tzipori, even though Tzipori was also a city. The Sanhedrin was in Tzipori. Rebbe moved to Tzipori. But for some reason, Rava says no. There's that whatever we're talking about here, the eulogy and the praise, that had to, when it talks about Rekes, it had to be referring to Teverya, because he could have just said maybe Rekes is Tzipori, and all these praises happen in Tzipori. For some reason, that's not the case, unless maybe they didn't bury in Tzipori, because there's definitely a basic forest in Teverya. Elam Rava or Rava. So the answer is Chamasu Chamigror, and Rakas is Teverya. So he doesn't agree with Rabbi Yochanan, even though Rabbi Yochanan had elders to support what he said. No one's doubting that the elders said he was right. But Chamas is Chamigror. There's an area called Chamigror. And I think that's south. It's about names. You said, what was it? What was the place you said before the springs in the south over there? But it's called, I'll bring it up here in the chat. You said it was, I forget what it was.
Hamat Gadar.
Hamat Geder. So maybe that's what he means over here by Chamas Gerar, Hamat Geder. I don't know. Rakas is Teverya. Kinneret is Ginoiser. So that we're going to stick with the valley of the north. Velomanikishma Rakas. So we said that Tzipori was called Rakas, and it made sense because Rakas means the top of the river, and Tzipori is on top of the mountain. So why would we call Teverya Rakas? What's it mean? So here's an interesting, a famous Gemara that is Bechlal attributed to the Jewish people. That's why we eat pomegranates in Rosh Hashanah. Why is it called Rakas? That even the simple people, the empty people, Rakas from the word Rekonim, seemingly empty of Torah study and Torah observance, they still are full of mitzvahs like a rimon, like a pomegranate. Just like a pomegranate has many seeds, so too even the most simple people of Teverya were full of mitzvahs like a rimon. Again, this is attributed to Eretz Yisrael Bechlal. That's why one of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael is a rimon, is a pomegranate. And again, this is the same idea as why we eat the pomegranate on Rosh Hashanah, to kind of give in the Day of Judgment, to tell Hashem that even your most simple Jew, who maybe doesn't look to you as, the super Jew, open that Jew up and you're going to see that he or she is full of mitzvahs like a pomegranate. Rabbi Yirmiyah disagrees. He says, Rakas Shema. Why is it called Rakas? Veloma Nikra Shema Teverya. So first of all, Rava says that her name is Teverya. And we refer to in the pasuk as Rakas because Teverya is full of mitzvahs like a pomegranate. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, no, her real name is Rakas. Veloma Nikra Shema Teverya. Why did we call her Teverya? Sheyesheves b'tibura shel Eretz Yisrael. It sits in the center of Eretz Yisrael, kind of in the upper center of Eretz Yisrael, and that would be Teverya, which would be where the Kinneret, where the Teverya is. Rava Omar Rakas Shema. Rava says her name is Rakas. The reason why there's parentheses is because we're not sure if this is Rabba or Rava. The Rabba was the teacher of Rava. Is Amar Rakas Shema V'Lama Nikreis Shema Teverya. The word Teverya is from the word that kind of Teverya. Teverya, that its appearance is good. Again, Teverya is one of the most beautiful cities in Eretz Yisrael. It's a beautiful city, beautiful place. It still hasn't. It's one of the underdeveloped places still of Eretz Yisrael. The north is less developed than the center, and it never had the kind of the full covered of other places in Israel, but it's a beautiful city. B'tibura, it says be'emtzis. Okay, let's just do the Rebbe Steinsaltz, and then we're going to stop here. I feel the author Turi Evan asks, why is this applied specifically to Teverya? That Teverya, its simple people are full of mitzvahs like a pomegranate. The Gemara elsewhere in Brachas 57a said this is of the entire Jewish people. That's what we read in Rosh Hashanah, a pomegranate. It would appear that Rabbah emphasized in this Gemara that it was even more true in Teverya due to the city's unique position as a religious capital of the Eretz Yisrael for many generations. Even during the time of Rav Sadia Gaon, which was much later, we know Rav Sadia Gaon at some point was in Eretz Yisrael, it was considered an important religious center. I think there was a Gaon in Teverya as well. Additionally, the vowel notation system for Hebrew language that is used today was developed in Teverya. I guess that would be a reason why you would say that they're mali mitzvah skirimoin of pomegranate. Why is it called Teverya? It's certainly well known that the city is named for the Roman Emperor Tiberius. Nevertheless, and why does the Gemara ignore that obvious fact? So he says, nevertheless, the name of the city is interpreted in a way that to give kind of foreign words to Hebrew interpretation, not just to say that it was called Teverya because of Tiberius, but also because of some deeper meaning. Tosfos explains the city essentially pleasing. The Maharsha explains that the phrase should be interpreted to mean that Tiberius was the seat of the great Sanhedrin for a time, and the sages who resided there could perceive things that others could not. So the word of Riyah is not talking about that it looks nice, but there's good visual. The rabbis see things well. According to this word, Riyah is to be interpreted in its vision. Others write that since Tiberius did not have a wall on the side that bordered the sea, so its views were nice. It looked into the Golden Heights or to the east part of the Kinneret. Everyone knows you stand in Teverya, the view is beautiful. So the wall didn't block the view. Maybe that's why they didn't build a wall to block the view of the beautiful Golden Heights. All right, everyone, we're going to stop over here, and we will continue, B'ezras Hashem, this discussion about Teverya, Tzipori, and other places, and get more into the so to say, the depth of the conversation more halachically, B'ezras Hashem next week. Thank you much for joining. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.